As promised, here is Amanita Muscaria in the Koran. To begin, we need to understand the context of Islam and the life of Muhammad. The background that sets the stage for the emergence of Islam and the composition of the Quran is required for us to explore the themes of the Amanita mushroom present in Muhammad's work. I encourage you to watch my video on Amanita Muscaria in the Bible, which covers the fertility cults of the Near East, as well as Judaism and Christianity. You don't necessarily need to watch that video first, but if you are questioning how we know the sacred mushroom is involved in those religions and the evidence for it, it will make this video a lot more comprehensible. Not only that video, but the stages of abstraction is important as well. That video was partly made as a precursor to this one, since we are dealing with a religion that has gone through several of those stages. There is a rich history leading up to the Quran, so you can expect some level of knowledge required to begin this exploration of Amanita. I also have to disclaim that I have no ill intentions or mean no disrespect to Islam or any Islamic follower. My channel is mainly a research channel, and this in no way invalidates the religion or any religion. These come from a mycelium, which is probably the closest thing to God we have in this world, and in fact is the reason we have any notion of God. But again, refer to the stages of abstraction if you want to see how we went from mushroom to sort of dimensional creator. But enough of that, let's explore the Quran. There is pretty much no evidence of Amanita in the Quran. And you might be thinking, well, okay, that's it then for the video. But actually this is quite expected. At this stage of abstraction, the lore is lost. Only the literal scripture remains. This is very interesting because it makes Muhammad a mythoclast, meaning someone who decries or destroys myths. We see this in his writing style. Firstly, the voice of the Quran is written from God's perspective, and secondly, the way in which he explains the most important Old and New Testament stories. He gives context to why and how those events played out in relation to this new Islamic faith. The stories of the Bible came from Amanita Muscaria, which you can think of the mushroom as a myth maker. Everywhere this mushroom is consumed, legends are created and myths are born. These myths abstracted from their source of mythology and became more like fables of right and wrong, and these narratives of events so impossible that they required a deity to be present in guiding them. Muhammad built Islam off of those myths, only he removed the myth part of it. All of the coded mushroom lore is gone and replaced with a more literal interpretation of the scripture, albeit one that is fairly unique to all of Christianity and Judaism. But this is a natural progression of abstraction. In Muhammad's case, he had a very specific and intentional reason for doing this. Muhammad led an interesting life, spending his childhood and the first half of his adulthood traveling between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea as a caravan trader. During this time, there was no real consistency in the religious life of the Middle East as a whole. Christians, Jews, pagans, they all mixed, and mainly it was these Gnostic or heretical mystery cults that were driven out by the Roman Catholic Church, driven out into the desert. So there was an interesting blend, and often it was tumultuous, with idol worshippers and ascetics of a wide variety of beliefs. Muhammad himself was well liked and considered to be an honest person, and it appears he spent a lot of time learning and talking to these various ascetics that he met along the way. He'd often spend a lot of time meditating in caves and mountains. He disagreed with the worship of idols. It seems he thought it dishonest to worship God as an object. Many of his tribe relied on this idolatry for economic reasons as well as religious. His tribe, the Quraysh, guarded the Kaaba, which is still one of the most important sites in all of Islam. But this leads us to the night that changed his life forever, when he was visited by the angel Gabriel in the mountain of Jabal al-Nur, his favorite place to meditate. Now, normally we could say with some confidence that Muhammad consumed Amanita Muscaria and received his prophetic status from a deep meditative state, but there are a couple issues with proving it one way or the other. Here's some arguments for the consumption of that entheogen. For one, the consumption of a powerful hallucinogen would have been seen as receiving a message from God or a visitation by an angel. The mushroom was unlikely to be considered God by this point. It was merely a vessel or an instrument from which to experience a message from God. Remember that God and the mushroom were separated through abstraction by this point, so it fits that Muhammad could think of the experience as an angelic visitation, much like Jacob's encounter with an angel and the themes of ascension and ladders. It is also more than likely that Muhammad in his travels encountered many ascetics who had come from the older mystery rites of Judaism and Christianity, and so knew the powers of the mushroom. Even meeting many Buddhists and Hindus among other various religions and sects, he could have picked it up from any one of these groups. The problem with saying definitively one way or another is that Muhammad constructed Islam to do without any idols, without any other instruments of worship. He knew firsthand what happened to religions when there was a physical object required for worship. People fight and kill over it. An elite ultimately takes control and keeps it from everyone else, or else it just becomes a profit-driven venture. Muhammad was a genius, and so even if he used the mushroom to aid his meditations, he knew to separate that experience from his religion and the Quran so as not to create that division and confusion. He wanted Islam to be an honest religion. To argue against the use of the mushroom, other than there being no real physical evidence, Muhammad knew the idea of the myth and the role it played. And I'm not saying his experience of revelation was fabricated. I mean, purely from a historical, analytical viewpoint, being able to capture the imagination and play off of these widely accepted religious myths gave him a way in to the minds of the people. He wasn't suggesting a completely new religion based on nothing. He wanted to include his Abrahamic and Christian countrymen, and was of that kind of broad faith group anyways. He was well-read and a highly charismatic and intelligent person. Irregardless of that night or the years leading up to his revelation, the religion being Abrahamic already means it wouldn't have existed, or wouldn't have existed in the same way without the mushroom. But I'm not going to use that epistemological argument. There are some more possible references to Amanita, so let's move on. Some years later, about 10, Muhammad goes on his famous night journey, from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then up through the seven heavens to meet God, Jesus, Enoch, Joseph, Adam, Moses, and some other biblical figures. The story goes that Gabriel gave Muhammad a burak. It was a sort of chimera-like creature, a flying horse mule that took him on his journey and then ascended through the heavens. The burak comes from a word that means lightning, and already we see it ticking some classic Amanita symbolism. The idea of flight, especially of a horse, and that horse being a combination of multiple creatures. Think of the Pegasus, the dragon, the centaur, all Amanita creatures. Most mythological creatures come from the myth maker Amanita Muscaria. Arabia is the origin of most of these fantastical creatures, especially the ones you hear about from Greek mythology. A lot derive from here, for the express reason that Amanita fertility cults were the most prevalent and numerous in this broad landscape. Muhammad's flight fits the idea of an Amanita journey through the spiritual realm. Later depictions are clearly inspired by Amanita, which does not necessarily mean Muhammad used it. Amanita symbolism is so entrenched in this region of the world, it's just as likely that folklore mixed with this event. But to counter that, the night journey was described like that of an Amanita trip, even if the illustrations didn't depict that until later. Central to any religion is the idea of a paradise, a reward for a life of piety and faith. In Islam, this is the Garden of Delights. Muhammad's idea of this paradise garden is inspired by the Garden of Adonis, which has its roots in the Near East. The story of Adonis is one of a dying and rising god archetype. The story comes from the older Mesopotamian Inanna and Dumazed, or Ishtar and Tammuz, in which Adonis is born and dies rapidly. It is primarily a female cult. Adonis is a beloved young and handsome man that Aphrodite ultimately falls in love with, but because of some certain events that take place, Persephone also finds him handsome, and there is a dispute which Zeus settles by declaring that Adonis must spend part of the year in the underworld with Persephone and part of the year above ground with Aphrodite. Adonis goes on to choose Aphrodite as his love, but is killed by a boar shortly after. It is said that where his blood flowed, flowers started to grow. Where the myth gets really interesting is in Adonis's androgynous description. Many male gods like Apollo, Heracles, and Dionysus also fall in love with him. Yet in these instances, Adonis takes on a feminine form and role. So the festival of Adonis, or the Garden of Adonis, involved women planting small gardens in shallow baskets or pieces of broken jars, using fast-growing plants like fennel, lettuce, or barley, and placing these gardens on the flat roofs of their houses under the summer heat. The plants would sprout swiftly and then just as quickly wither and die, since the gardens were too shallow. While they grew, incense was burned for Adonis. But when the plants died, they would lament and mourn loudly, tearing off their clothes and beating their hands against their breasts. They would then gather all the mini gardens from their roofs and a statuette of Adonis. What followed was a funeral procession that ended with them throwing the effigy of Adonis and all of the withered plants into the sea. Interestingly enough, this yearly ceremony is quite old, already being established in Lesbos by the 7th century BC and popularized in Athens by the 5th century BC. Yet this comes from older Mesopotamian ceremonies which seem to be largely the same. Adonis was a word that originally just meant lord, as in a sort of lord that protects, that casts shade, and comparisons to Baal have been made. The goal of the ceremony was to grow something. It was some sort of magic ritualistic process in order to encourage the rebirth of Adonis, kind of like the way his blood produced those flowers. There's a lot going on here with this myth and the ceremony, but let's break it down because it is entirely about the Amanita Muscaria, and this is important because the Garden of Adonis is the basis for Muhammad's idea of a paradise. Adonis as a strong masculine figure who spends his life alternating between the underworld and the normal world with the ability to turn feminine encapsulates the idea of a hermaphroditic god. The Amanita has always been depicted as bearing both qualities of man and female. The mushroom begins its life underground, and then with rain, shade, and lightning produces an egg. This white egg is called a womb, or vulva, otherwise known as the universal veil. When the mushroom sprouts, the stem ruptures through the womb and is compared to that of a phallus. And then the mushroom cap is often related from everything to the tip of a phallus, the sun, the moon, a breast, the heavens, an eye, depending greatly on the culture and the rituals. But knowing this anatomical comparison is important in grasping why the Adonis gardens were so explicit. Adonis is a strapping young god, the ideal male form, just as the Amanita is like an engorged phallus. The dynamic of fertile male and female gods play to this sort of ecstasy idea of the mushroom state with the land and the men and women being healthy and virile. Adonis spending half of his time underground is a reference to the growth cycle of the Amanita and how promiscuous the mushroom was, that it would often leave them to be with Persephone underground. And even when Adonis chooses Aphrodite, it is not long before he is killed, which shows the desire of the mushroom's fickle nature to never stay long above ground. And furthermore, we have the blood causing new things to grow. This is a common god archetype seen all over the world where there is Amanita worship. The lamenting and mourning is a sort of summoning process to encourage the growth of the mushroom, using quick sprouting plants as a reference to the instantaneous growth of the mushroom and its swift decay once fully matured. The use of the word garden through the Semitic language meant simply canopy. The canopy or shade was a reference to the cap of the mushroom and how it created a canopy once fully matured. The Arabic garden of delight is Ganati Naimi. This derives from the Semitic Gan Naiman, or garden of Adonis. The Hebrew equivalent to this idea of lord or canopy is Eden, hence where we get the Garden of Eden. The same allusion to the mushroom as the Garden of Adonis. So the Garden of Eden comes from the Garden of Adonis, and the Garden of Adonis comes from the previous Ishtar Tammuz rituals and ceremonies from Mesopotamia. But John Allegro explores this etymological link further in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Muhammad using the Garden of Adonis as inspiration for his idea of a paradise is not only peculiar, but suggests his relationship with some of these different cults that survived the Roman and Catholic purges. The entire notion of paradise being filled with the houris, the wide-eyed, full-breasted nymphs, is directly related to the woman who practiced the Garden of Adonis ceremonies and the general themes of Amanita Muscaria being related to fertility themes. His inclusion of this, I think, indicated further his personal association with the Amanita Muscaria mushroom and some of its surrounding ceremonies he witnessed, and I believe he had first-hand experience with the mushroom. His interpretation of the Abrahamic stories is unique and baffles scholars to this day, both where he learned slightly variant stories and the particular vocabulary he chooses to use. And I think after reading the Quran, the Islamic religion should mostly be compared to Buddhism. While he may have had some actual influence from Buddhism, just the entire structure of the religion is very close to Buddhism. How it's more of a series of beliefs and practices with clear guides and a way of life, rather than a set of rituals centered around a mythology like in Judaism and Christianity. Furthermore, Siddhartha and Muhammad both founded their respective beliefs by being meditative ascetics with deep and subtle associations with the mushroom. The Amanita gave them insights into the world. It was a tool of revelation rather than the experience of God himself. Both Islam and Buddhism fall into that same level of abstraction. They just came from different cultures and derived from different religions. In both cases, the Amanita played a central role in those religions and societies and what ended up deriving from those. More evidence can be found in Islam concerning the Amanita in the group known as the Hashashin, or the Assassins. This underground Islamic cult surfaced around the time of the Crusades and spread pretty far before being destroyed in the 13th century by the Mongols in a last stand in their stronghold in Alamut Castle. They were feared for a very long time as their warriors were supposedly inebriated and had an unwavering, zealous sense of duty. They would carry out public assassinations without thought of consequence. This secret order centered around the idea of an ecstasy garden in which its members were initiated by drinking a special intoxicant and experiencing paradise, very much described like the Garden of Adonis. This apparently was enough to fully believe and commit themselves to their cause. They would also be intoxicated during missions and battles. The accepted drug used is hash, a processed sort of resin deriving from cannabis. The actual word hash just means some sort of intoxicant or inebriation and wasn't specific to cannabis at the time. Their drug also seemed to be a drink, not something smoked. Not to mention the unlikelihood of hash as a stimulant for not only ecstasy, but also to be used in assassinations. Hash makes little sense considering its effects are to relax and give bouts of laughter and change perception of time. this would not make you into a feared and skilled warrior. However, with Amanita Muscaria, there is evidence of the mushroom being used to endow the warrior with the fury of God, to literally fight possessed by the gods. We see this in the Berserker, the Askari, who were much like the Hashashin, only 1,000 years prior, the Israelites when they fought the Canaanites, and possibly Aztec and Egyptian warriors, to name a few. Though it is perhaps apocryphal to say that Amanita was used by certain cultures or groups to enhance physical abilities, there are legends of strong heroes possessing godlike powers in mythology, like Gilgamesh, Cuchulainn, and King Arthur, who all fit into Amanita themes, which I'll explore in a future video. The Amanita either resurfaced in Islam or was always there in the underground of certain Islamic groups. Perhaps they just mixed with pagan cults that had survived, or simply the themes of gardens and the Amanita persisted throughout Islam from the beginning. This was the information I found or came up with, and I hope you enjoyed the video. A final note, despite being the most abstract of all the Abrahamic religions, it is the most direct and to the point. The discarding of myth, since the mythmaker mushroom was removed, makes more sense than to keep the myths and remove the mythmaker, as in the case of Christianity, which I think is the genius of Muhammad in creating as honest a religion as he could. I am simply fascinated by the archetypes of religious motifs and the relationship with fungus and fertility cults. Everything is based on that because those marked our beginnings as a species developing culture and rituals. Thanks for watching.